King Charles III has finally succeeded to evict his brother, Prince Andrew, from Royal Lodge, the grand estate he has called home for decades. Despite King Charles's clear desire for his younger sibling to downsize to a more manageable property, the Duke of York has successfully resisted the pressure. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. His victory, as reported by the UK's Express, is not a matter of family reconciliation but a direct result of his legal standing. Prince Andrew holds a 75-year lease on the property, a legally binding agreement with the Crown Estate signed in 2003, which gives him the right to remain there as long as he adheres to its terms. This outcome solidifies his place at Royal Lodge, at least for the foreseeable future, in spite of the ongoing controversy that has shrouded him since he stepped back from public life. A Pyrrhic victory with high stakes. While Prince Andrew has won the immediate battle over his residency, royal experts are quick to point out that this is a hollow victory. Hilary Fordwich, a British royals expert, referred to it as a limited Pyrrhic win, emphasizing that it does not signify any improvement in his public image or his standing within the royal family. The Duke's continued presence at Royal Lodge is rooted in legal rights, not personal favor. This distinction is crucial, as it highlights the deep rift that still exists between him and the rest of the family. The real test now is whether Andrew can manage the immense financial burden that comes with maintaining a property of Royal Lodge's scale. The estate is a financial black hole, with upkeep costs reportedly running into the millions of dollars each year. As a non-working royal, Andrew is no longer funded by the Crown for these expenses, leaving him to foot the entire bill for repairs, security, and general maintenance. This situation places him under intense public scrutiny, as every penny spent on his lavish lifestyle is now viewed as an entitled embarrassment, according to Fordwich. The pressure to manage these costs has led to some surprising behavior, with the Daily Mail reporting that the Duke has been seen tending to the gardens himself, a clear indication of his need to pinch pennies. Deterioration and a looming deadline. The financial strain is made even more apparent by the extensive disrepair of Royal Lodge. Reports from Us Weekly have detailed the mansion's poor condition, noting issues with dampness, peeling paint, and significant cracks in the brickwork. Plaster is reportedly falling from the walls, indicating a state of serious neglect. These issues make the annual upkeep not just a luxury, but a critical necessity. The longer these problems are left unaddressed, the more expensive and complex the repairs will become. This looming maintenance crisis could provide King Charles with another opportunity to force a change in residency. Fordwich warns that the Crown Estate has grounds to revisit the lease in 2028. If Prince Andrew is found to be in violation of the lease's terms, particularly regarding property maintenance, he could face a new attempt at eviction. Royal expert Ian Pelham-Turner supports this, stating that the state of the lodge will be looked at very closely, and that Andrew must prove he can prevent its near collapse. This puts the Duke in a precarious position. His residency is secure for now, but only as long as he can prove he is a responsible steward of the property. Royal intrigue in a troubled future. The situation at Royal Lodge is more than just a housing dispute. It's a reflection of the deep-seated tensions within the royal family. King Charles's desire for his brother to downsize is reportedly tied to a broader push to streamline the monarchy and reduce its financial burden on the public. By removing priceless artifacts from the lodge, citing security and maintenance concerns, the king has signaled his disapproval and his willingness to exert pressure where he can, even if he cannot legally evict his brother. Richard Fitzwilliams, another royal expert, confirmed that while King Charles would have preferred his brother to move, the lease agreement tied his hands. The ongoing saga of Royal Lodge serves as a constant reminder of Prince Andrew's fall from grace and the difficult position he now occupies, caught between his legal rights and the expectations of his family and the public. The coming years will reveal whether he can meet the challenge of maintaining the crumbling estate, or if the burden will finally force him to relinquish his hold on his royal home. The conflict between King Charles and Prince Andrew wasn't born out of personal animosity alone. It was rooted in the cold, hard arithmetic of money. Specifically, the immense, jaw-dropping cost of maintaining Royal Lodge. To the average person, the idea of a 30-room mansion is the stuff of fairy tales and Hollywood movies. But in the reality of the British monarchy, it was a financial sinkhole, a burden that was becoming increasingly impossible to justify. The numbers, when laid bare, are staggering. Experts have estimated that the annual upkeep for Royal Lodge, including everything from landscaping for its expansive 21 acres of grounds to security, runs into the millions of pounds. Some sources put the figure as high as £5 million per year. To give that some perspective, that's roughly the annual salary of a top-tier Premier League footballer, just to keep a house from falling apart. This wasn't just about general maintenance. It was about a building with a history stretching back to the 19th century, a structure that demanded constant, meticulous care. Think about the costs. A dedicated team of gardeners alone could cost hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. The security detail, which was once paid for by the Crown, was a separate, multi-million-pound expense. And then there were the unexpected costs, the emergency repairs, the endless cycle of structural work that is a reality for any historic building. Reports have detailed everything from crumbling stonework and peeling paint to a dire need for a new roof, with some estimates for the required repairs soaring to over £1 million. For the public, who were already questioning the cost of the monarchy, this was a line in the sand. Every report of a new crack in the brickwork or a new leak in the roof was a fresh reason for outrage. This wasn't an abstract concern for King Charles, it was a central pillar of his reform agenda. He understood that in a modern, democratic society, the monarchy's legitimacy rests on public goodwill. And public goodwill erodes when people feel their tax money is being spent on what they perceive as a private luxury for a disgraced individual. For years, Prince Andrew had been a source of scandal, but now he was a financial liability as well. The very thought of public funds, even indirectly, supporting his lifestyle was politically toxic. Charles, with his decades of preparation for the throne, knew this. He saw the numbers and understood the optics, and he knew that the problem of Royal Lodge had to be solved, and solved quickly. But how was Prince Andrew paying for it all? That was the great mystery. After he was stripped of his royal duties, his official income, a tax-free allowance from his mother, was terminated. He was left with only a modest naval pension and whatever private wealth he had accrued over the years, a figure that remains a subject of intense speculation. Experts and commentators alike have questioned how he could possibly afford the millions required for upkeep. The answers were vague and unsatisfying, leading to a public narrative of a prince who was either hopelessly in debt or was being secretly bankrolled by a mysterious benefactor. The latter, as we will explore, was a particularly painful point of contention. The idea that his family, or even worse, his brother, might be secretly bailing him out, only intensified the public's anger and sense of betrayal. The situation created an impossible paradox for Prince Andrew. He clung to Royal Lodge as a symbol of his status, but by doing so, he was financially and reputationally destroying himself. Every decision he made, every rumor of his cost-cutting measures, like the story of him doing his own gardening, only served to reinforce the image of a man out of his depth. He was a symbol of an old, extravagant way of life that the new king was determined to end. The financial burden of the house was not just a practical problem, it was a strategic weapon in the hands of his opponents. And in this case, his primary opponent was the very institution he had been born into. The king's approach was a masterclass in leveraging a financial argument to achieve a political objective. He didn't just tell Andrew to leave, he made it financially untenable for him to stay. By cutting off his allowance and making it clear that public funds would no longer be used for his upkeep or security, Charles forced a difficult choice upon his brother. It was a choice between his pride and his financial solvency. And in the end, it was a choice Andrew was simply not equipped to make. The financial drain of Royal Lodge was, in a sense, a siege. The king was starving his brother out, using the numbers as a tool of persuasion far more effective than any emotional appeal. The ultimate victory would not be won in a shouting match, but in the brutal, irrefutable reality of a bank statement. The public, for their part, were a chorus of condemnation. Social media was alight with comments about how the money could be better spent on public services, on hospitals, on schools. The optics were a disaster. While the country was facing a cost of living crisis, a disgraced royal was living in a crumbling mansion that cost a fortune to maintain. This public sentiment was a powerful weapon for King Charles. It provided him with the moral high ground, allowing him to frame his actions not as an act of familial cruelty, but as a necessary step in service of the nation and the monarchy. The financial drain of Royal Lodge was more than a number on a balance sheet, it was the ultimate justification for a king to make the most difficult decision of his reign. The mystery of how Andrew would continue to pay for it all became a central part of the story, fueling speculation and keeping him in the headlines. His former wife, Sarah Ferguson, had cohabited with him for a period, leading some to wonder if she was contributing. Others speculated about hidden trusts or secret deals. But the one undeniable truth was that a man who had been accustomed to a life of boundless privilege was now financially isolated. The lavish lifestyle that had defined his life was now an impossible dream, and the home that was meant to be his refuge had become his most formidable opponent. The financial drain of Royal Lodge was the first domino to fall in the long, drawn-out process of Prince Andrew's final exile. The foundation of Prince Andrew's defiant stance was not built on an emotional appeal or a plea for familial mercy. It was built on a piece of paper, a legally binding contract signed in 2003. At the time, it seemed like a perfectly sound, even beneficial, arrangement. Following the death of the Queen Mother, who had resided at Royal Lodge, the property was in a state of disrepair. Prince Andrew, eager to move in, negotiated a deal with the Crown Estate. It wasn't a grace and favor residence, which could be taken away at a monarch's whim. Instead, it was a commercial lease, a very specific and unusual one that would become the primary legal obstacle to his eviction. The terms were unprecedented. Prince Andrew was granted a 75-year lease. For a one-time premium payment of £1 million, a figure that was considered a bargain even then, he secured the right to live in the sprawling estate for the rest of his life and beyond. The lease also included a handful of cottages and acres of land. But the most significant part of the agreement was a key clause. In exchange for the long-term lease, Andrew was required to undertake extensive refurbishments at his own expense. At the time, the cost of these renovations was estimated at around £7.5 million. He was to repair, renew, uphold, clean and keep in repair and, where necessary, rebuild the mansion. The contract also stipulated that he could not sell the lease for a profit and that if he were to die, it could only be passed on to his widow or his two daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. This agreement was, for all intents and purposes, a fortress. For years, it was his ultimate protection. When the scandal broke and calls for his removal from Royal Lodge grew louder, his lawyers could simply point to the lease. He was not a squatter or a guest, he was a tenant with the full force of a legal document behind him. He believed, and for a long time the palace seemingly agreed, that King Charles simply could not legally force him out. The Crown Estate is a separate entity, managed by commissioners with a duty to maintain and enhance the value of the estate. While the king technically owns the estate, in right of the crown, he does not manage it or make decisions about its assets. This legal separation was Andrew's shield. It meant that the king could not simply use his power as sovereign to kick his brother out. Any action would have to come from the Crown Estate itself, and it would have to be based on a breach of the lease. This is where the story of the crumbling mansion becomes not just a financial tale but a legal one. The same clause that was supposed to protect Andrew, the one requiring him to maintain the property, was also his greatest vulnerability. For years, the issue was one of money. Could Andrew afford the upkeep? But as the standoff intensified, the question shifted. Had he fulfilled his obligation to keep the property in good repair? Reports of the dampness, the peeling paint, and the structural cracks now took on a new, much more sinister meaning. They weren't just signs of neglect, they were potential breaches of contract. The legal battle that began to take shape was a classic high-stakes game of leverage. King Charles and his team, with the full backing of public sentiment and their own pragmatic agenda, began to look for any possible loophole in the 75-year lease. They didn't need to invalidate the entire contract, they just needed to prove that Andrew was in breach of its terms. This is where the narrative pivots from one of familial tension to a legal drama. The reports of the house's disrepair were no longer just tabloid fodder, they were evidence. What followed was a quiet but fierce war of attrition. Charles's side would leak stories about the state of the property to the press, highlighting the mounting repair costs and Andrew's apparent inability to pay. This put Andrew on the defensive, forcing him to issue vague denials and promises to find the necessary funds. But the burden of proof was shifting. The lease, which was once his protection, was now a constant, looming threat. The more he failed to demonstrate that he was upholding his end of the bargain, the more grounds the Crown Estate had to act. And while the king could not directly order the eviction, he could certainly exert pressure on the commissioners of the Crown Estate, and he could use the relentless media scrutiny as a powerful tool to weaken his brother's position. The once unbreakable fortress of the 75-year lease was beginning to show cracks, just like the walls of Royal Lodge itself. The legal rights that Prince Andrew so confidently held were not an absolute shield but a conditional one, dependent on his ability to meet the very obligations that were now proving to be his undoing. For the final act to have a profound impact, one must first understand the escalating tension that preceded it. This wasn't a sudden fit of rage from a newly crowned king. It was a calculated campaign, a war of attrition waged with icy politeness and unyielding pressure. King Charles's attempts to get Prince Andrew to leave Royal Lodge began as gentle suggestions, a soft-spoken request to consider a change. In the early days, following the Queen's death, the conversations were framed with a veneer of concern and practicality. The king would mention the immense financial burden of the estate, or the need for a senior working royal to occupy a residence of such symbolic importance. But Andrew, buoyed by the perceived invincibility of his lease and his belief that his older brother would never truly abandon him, dismissed these overtures. He was in denial, living in a self-constructed bubble of imagined importance. He saw the suggestions as minor inconveniences, a bit of royal housekeeping that he, as a fixture of the family, could simply ignore. He would tell friends he was resolute in his decision to stay put. He believed that the weight of their shared history, their bond as brothers, would be enough to keep the king from taking any decisive action. This was his fundamental miscalculation. As weeks turned into months, the polite suggestions became more pointed. The king's team began to leak stories to the press, not to embarrass Andrew, but to apply pressure. The media, a powerful tool in any royal drama, became an extension of the king's will. They reported on the staggering cost of Royal Lodge, on the structural issues, and on the fact that a non-working royal was occupying a home that could be used by Prince William or another senior member. Each article was a subtle, but effective, turning of the screw. The first major blow was the termination of Prince Andrew's annual allowance, a significant sum that had been a lifeline for him. The king, in a move that was both fiscally responsible and strategically brutal, cut off the tap. He also ended the funding for Andrew's private security detail, an expense of several £1 million a year. The message was clear: if you wish to live like a royal, you must either work as a royal or fund it yourself. This move was designed to make his position at Royal Lodge financially untenable. The king was, in effect, laying down an ultimatum: downsize to a smaller, more affordable residence, and I will continue to provide for you. Refuse, and you are on your own. Andrew's response was a mix of stubbornness and defiance. He reportedly told friends that he was a proud man, and would not be forced out. He was offered Frogmore Cottage, a 5-bedroom home that had been vacated by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. To anyone on the outside, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable offer, a compromise that would allow him to remain on the Windsor estate, close to his family, while reducing his living costs. But to Andrew, it was an insult. He saw Frogmore Cottage not as a home, but as a demotion, a sign that he was being relegated to a lesser status. He was too proud to accept what he viewed as a handout. This refusal was the final straw for the king. It proved that Andrew was not just financially irresponsible, he was unwilling to cooperate, unable to see the bigger picture, and completely blind to the damage he was doing to the monarchy. The king's patience was now officially exhausted. What began as a family matter had become a political problem. The public was watching, the media was relentless, and the very future of his reign depended on his ability to show strength and decisiveness. He had offered his brother a way out, and Andrew had refused it. There was only one course of action left. The polite suggestions and veiled threats had failed. It was time for an ultimatum that could not be ignored. The king's decision was now final. The negotiations were over. The era of appeasement was at an end. This was no longer a family spat over a house, it was a test of the king's authority. Could he, as the head of the institution, make the tough, unpopular decisions necessary to protect the monarchy from a self-inflicted wound? The answer was a resounding yes. The king had exhausted all other options. He had tried diplomacy, he had tried financial pressure, and he had even offered a generous compromise. Andrew had rejected them all. In doing so, he had left the king no choice. The confrontation was now inevitable, and the outcome would be both swift and brutal. The king's patience had run out. The polite suggestions, the subtle press leaks, the financial ultimatums, all had failed to move Prince Andrew from his stubborn position. The time for veiled diplomacy was over. The stage was set for the final, decisive confrontation. This was not a meeting to be held in the polished, public-facing rooms of Buckingham Palace. This was a private reckoning, a difficult conversation that would take place in an environment where the truth, no matter how painful, could not be avoided. The exact details of the meeting are known only to a few, but a picture can be painted from the accounts of palace insiders and royal observers. It was likely a meeting held on neutral ground, perhaps at Windsor Castle itself, a place steeped in the kind of history and duty that Charles revered and that Andrew, in his defiance, seemed to have forgotten. The atmosphere was reportedly cold, devoid of the usual familial warmth. This wasn't a conversation between two brothers, it was a conversation between a king and a subject who had become a liability. The king, a man of quiet authority, did not shout. He did not lose his temper. Instead, he presented his brother with the unassailable logic of the situation. He laid out the case with a surgeon's precision. He spoke of the monarchy's reputation, the financial strain on the institution, and the public's growing intolerance for a non-working royal living in a palace. He spoke of his own duty, his solemn promise to uphold the crown and its integrity. He likely reminded Andrew that he had been given a way out, a path to a more dignified existence at Frogmore Cottage, and that he had refused it. The subtext of the conversation was devastatingly simple: your pride has cost you everything. For Prince Andrew, this must have been a moment of shocking clarity. For so long, he had believed himself to be untouchable, protected by his birthright and the love of his mother. Now, faced with his brother's resolute and final stance, he was forced to confront a reality he had spent years denying. The shield of his 75-year lease, which he had so long brandished as his ultimate defense, was now useless. The king's argument wasn't based on the letter of the law but on the unwritten, more powerful law of the institution itself. He had broken faith with the public, and in doing so, he had forfeited his right to their support. The king's argument was not, "You must leave because the law says so," but, "You must leave because I, the king, say so, and my authority is derived from a moral contract with the people that you have broken." Andrew's reaction, according to those close to the family, was a mix of shock, anger, and a desperate, final plea. He may have tried to argue, to plead his case, to remind Charles of their bond. He may have pointed to his own perceived innocence in the matters that had disgraced him. But the king was unmoved. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The meeting likely ended with a clear and unambiguous timeline for his departure. There would be no more negotiation. There would be no more compromises. The offer of Frogmore Cottage was still on the table, but the message was now delivered as an order, not a suggestion. It was an order to downsize, to move out of the financial and public spotlight, and to accept his new, greatly diminished status. The confrontation was not a win-loss scenario, it was a unilateral declaration of authority, a final display of the brutal pragmatism that defines a king's rule. The family bond, once thought to be an unbreakable chain, had been severed for the good of the institution. And in the silence that followed, both men would have understood the true, cold cost of a crown. The confrontation was over, and the battle was lost. The king had given his final order. Now came the hard, brutal reality of the logistics of eviction. This was not a simple matter of changing the locks. Prince Andrew was still a royal, and the property was filled with centuries of royal artifacts and personal belongings. The process was meticulously planned, designed to be executed with speed and discretion to avoid a full-blown public spectacle. While the palace maintained its customary public silence, the wheels were turning behind the scenes. The first, and most symbolic, act was the removal of items from Royal Lodge that belonged to the royal collection. This was not a punitive measure in a legal sense, but a powerful show of force. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the vast art and artifacts of the monarchy, has a duty to protect its assets. Citing the widely reported disrepair of the building, the Royal Collection took the opportunity to declare that the safety and security of its valuable items could no longer be guaranteed at Royal Lodge. What followed was a quiet but significant operation. Priceless paintings, antique furniture, and historical treasures were carefully catalogued and transported out of the mansion. For Prince Andrew, this must have been a devastating blow. The removal of these treasures was not just a practical action, it was a public declaration that he was no longer trusted to care for the family's heritage. The house, which he had clung to as a symbol of his status, was now being stripped of its very essence. The physical act of eviction itself was not a dramatic, high-stakes raid. It was a gradual, methodical process. Andrew was given a clear timeline to vacate the property and move to Frogmore Cottage. The security detail, which had been a point of contention and had been funded by the king, was officially withdrawn. Andrew now had to bear the cost of his own security, an expense he reportedly could not afford. This was the final piece of the puzzle, a financial lever that left him with no viable choice but to comply. The king's team had weaponized his financial vulnerability. They had turned his lavish lifestyle into a cage from which there was no escape. When the news of the eviction finally broke, the public reaction was a mix of shock and a sense of grim satisfaction. The media, which had been following the story for months, exploded with headlines. The narrative was clear: the new king was not afraid to take decisive action, even against his own brother. It was seen as a bold move, a sign that the monarchy was, at last, prioritizing its image and its future over personal sentiment. While some royal commentators expressed a degree of sympathy for Andrew, the overwhelming public opinion was that he had brought this upon himself. The contrast between the two brothers could not have been more stark. King Charles was portrayed as a man of duty, a pragmatic leader making the tough choices for the good of the institution. Prince Andrew was cast as a man of stubborn pride, a relic of a bygone era who had refused to adapt. The public saw a king who was willing to give up a personal relationship for the good of the country and a prince who was willing to risk the family's reputation for the sake of a house. The media, in its coverage, drew a clear line between the two, framing the eviction not as a moment of family tragedy but as a moment of institutional triumph. The story of the eviction was now a cautionary tale. It was a warning to any other royal who might be tempted to live outside the new king's vision. The message was unambiguous: in the new monarchy, there are no free rides. There are no untouchables. The days of grace and favor, residences for extended family members are over. Every royal now has to earn their place, and every privilege comes with a price. Prince Andrew, in his exile, was now a living testament to that new reality. He had been cast out not with a sword, but with a ledger. And in the process, the king had not only solved a public relations problem, he had sent a clear and powerful message about the future of his reign. For the final act to have a profound impact, one must first understand the escalating tension that preceded it. This wasn't a sudden fit of rage from a newly crowned king. It was a calculated campaign, a war of attrition waged with icy politeness and unyielding pressure. King Charles's attempts to get Prince Andrew to leave Royal Lodge began as gentle suggestions, a soft-spoken request to consider a change. In the early days, following the Queen's death, the conversations were framed with a veneer of concern and practicality. The king would mention the immense financial burden of the estate, or the need for a senior working royal to occupy a residence of such symbolic importance. But Andrew, buoyed by the perceived invincibility of his lease and his belief that his older brother would never truly abandon him, dismissed these overtures. He was in denial, living in a self-constructed bubble of imagined importance. He saw the suggestions as minor inconveniences, a bit of royal housekeeping that he, as a fixture of the family, could simply ignore. He would tell friends he was resolute in his decision to stay put. He believed that the weight of their shared history, their bond as brothers, would be enough to keep the king from taking any decisive action. This was his fundamental miscalculation. As weeks turned into months, the polite suggestions became more pointed. The king's team began to leak stories to the press, not to embarrass Andrew, but to apply pressure. The media, a powerful tool in any royal drama, became an extension of the king's will. They reported on the staggering cost of Royal Lodge, on the structural issues, and on the fact that a non-working royal was occupying a home that could be used by Prince William or another senior member. Each article was a subtle, but effective, turning of the screw. The first major blow was the termination of Prince Andrew's annual allowance, a significant sum that had been a lifeline for him. The king, in a move that was both fiscally responsible and strategically brutal, cut off the tap. He also ended the funding for Andrew's private security detail, an expense of several £1 million a year. The message was clear: if you wish to live like a royal, you must either work as a royal or fund it yourself. This move was designed to make his position at Royal Lodge financially untenable. The king was, in effect, laying down an ultimatum: downsize to a smaller, more affordable residence, and I will continue to provide for you. Refuse, and you are on your own. Andrew's response was a mix of stubbornness and defiance. He reportedly told friends that he was a proud man and would not be forced out. He was offered Frogmore Cottage, a 5-bedroom home that had been vacated by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. To anyone on the outside, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable offer, a compromise that would allow him to remain on the Windsor estate, close to his family, while reducing his living costs. But to Andrew, it was an insult. He saw Frogmore Cottage not as a home, but as a demotion, a sign that he was being relegated to a lesser status. He was too proud to accept what he viewed as a handout. This refusal was the final straw for the king. It proved that Andrew was not just financially irresponsible, he was unwilling to cooperate, unable to see the bigger picture, and completely blind to the damage he was doing to the monarchy. The king's patience was now officially exhausted. What began as a family matter had become a political problem. The public was watching, the media was relentless, and the very future of his reign depended on his ability to show strength and decisiveness. He had offered his brother a way out, and Andrew had refused it. There was only one course of action left. The polite suggestions and veiled threats had failed. It was time for an ultimatum that could not be ignored. The king's decision was now final. The negotiations were over. The era of appeasement was at an end. This was no longer a family spat over a house, it was a test of the king's authority. Could he, as the head of the institution, make the tough, unpopular decisions necessary to protect the monarchy from a self-inflicted wound? The answer was a resounding yes. The king had exhausted all other options. He had tried diplomacy, he had tried financial pressure, and he had even offered a generous compromise. Andrew had rejected them all. In doing so, he had left the king no choice. The confrontation